Harvey Mansfield. I'm moderator for this evening. The event tonight is co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School, the Program for Constitutional Government, and the Center for American Political Studies and the Department of Government, with funding from the John M. Olin Foundation and the Bradley Foundation in Wisconsin. Our speaker tonight is Alan Bloom of the University of Chicago. After he talks, he has prepared remarks, which he says will continue for about an hour. There will be two respondents, and after the respondents, there will be questions from the audience. Brief questions to be delivered from the microphones, if you please. Our two respondents tonight are first Henry Rosofsky, the Louis P. and Linda L. Geiser University Professor, a Fellow of Harvard College, and former Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. During his tenure, he disproved Machiavelli's maxim that a prince has to choose between being loved and being feared. Our second respondent is Stanley Cavell. Stanley Cavell is the Walter M. Cabot Professor of Aesthetics and General Theory of Value. I think that says it all. But he's also author of The Claim of Reason and Must We Mean What We Say? Our principal speaker is Alan Bloom, teacher, the best alive for my money. As a scholar, he studied education. He's translated and interpreted the best ancient book on education, Plato's Republic, and the best modern book on education, Rousseau's Emile. His most recent book, Closing of the American Mind, is a book about his teaching and what he found while he was teaching. It's success. And what a success. Well, Alan Bloom has always behaved as if he were famous. His friends know that. And now that he actually is famous, you see that fame hasn't spoiled him a bit. The success of this book was a rare moment in the life of democracy when a serious book became a popular book, and a whole people took a look at itself and its intellectual leaders. His subject tonight is the attack on reason. Professor Bloom.
If I were E.D. Hirsch, people do tend to mix this up nowadays, I might ask, what is the literary influence on my salutation? The answer is that it imitates Franklin D. Roosevelt's salutation to another very select audience, daughters of the American Revolution. He began his address, fellow immigrants. Roosevelt, of course, was gently ridiculing those ladies for believing that America, old stock, constitutes any title whatsoever to privilege. That notion is a relic of the aristocratic past, which this democracy supplanted in favor of equality or privilege based on merit alone. Roosevelt was urbane, witty, the century's greatest virtuoso democratic musician. We, the immigrants or the children of immigrants, loved his act. He was on our side. Our enjoyment of his joke was, of course, enhanced a bit by the acid of vengeance against those who thought they were better than us. Roosevelt knew how to manipulate such sentiments, and his slap at the DAR was not entirely disinterested, insofar as there were a lot more of us than there were of them. Moreover, Roosevelt's enjoyment was quite different from the kind of enjoyment that we had. He was really one of them. His family title was based on antiquity, wealth, and distinction. Were as good as practically anyone's. It was certainly more pleasant to poke fun at his equals or inferiors than to show resentment towards his superiors. He wasn't the same thing. His was a kind of aristocratic condescension. He condescended to rule a democracy, to be, as was often said about him at the time, a traitor to his class. A neat mixture of man's perpetual striving to be first and the demands of a society where all are held to be equal. The psychology of democracy is a complex and fascinating study. It is as a consequence of that study that I began as I did. The very unusual intensity of the response to my book is focused on its alleged elitism, a charge meant to make me suspect as an enemy of our democratic regime. And the first and loudest voices in this chorus came, truly surprised, from the Ivy League, particularly those with the Harvard connection, to the point where it came to me to paraphrase the old joke about the farmer who hears a thief in the chicken coop by substituting the Harvard coop, imagining myself yelling, "Who's in there?" and getting the answer, "There's nobody in here but us anti-elitists." Everybody knows that Harvard is in every respect, its students, its faculty, its library, and its endowment, the best university in the world. It can have pretty much what it wants in the way of students and professors. Long ago, when I, a little Westerner, a bit out of it, taught for a year at Yale, I was amazed at the little Harvard worm that was eating away at the souls of practically all the professors and students there. Except for the ones who had had the opportunity to be at Harvard that turned it down. Elite is not a word I care for very much, imprecise, smacking of sociological abstractions. But if any American institution of any kind merits that name, it is Harvard, and it lends that tincture to everyone associated with it. Why then the passion to accuse others of the crime of elitism? One is tempted to attribute this inclination to simple self-protectiveness. If we say he's one, they won't notice us. But I suspect this inclination on the part of some, or many, comes from the more tortuous, the more ambiguous sense of guilt. The leading principle of our regime is the equal worth of all persons. And facts or sentiments that appear to contradict that principle are experienced by a Democrat as immoral. Bad conscience accompanies the Democrat who finds himself a part of an elite. He tries to suppress or deny to himself whatever covert feelings he might experience. I'm sure that none of you have those, of the light of superiority, the fact that he or she has been distinguished by Harvard, how much better off he or she is than the poor jerks at Kalamazoo College, even that he or she deserves it, that superior gifts merit superior education, position, and esteem. Few might consciously believe such things, but since they would be at odds with the egalitarian opinions of democracy, they would tend to become spiritual outlaws, hypocrites, and cynically indifferent to justice. The rest, to soothe their consciences, have to engage in casuistry, not to say sophistry. The simple democratic answer could be to have open admissions at Harvard, just as there would be if Harvard were located on the European continent. Such elitism is not tolerated. But for reasons you can probably better explain to me than I to you, nobody here really considers that. Harvard, I gather, intends to remain adamantly implying thereby that there are significant natural differences among human beings. President Bach's way of squaring Harvard elitism with democratic right thinking is apparently to teach that the Harvard person is a doer of good works for society as a whole. This is in the spirit of Harvard's John Rawls, who permits inequality of goods and talents if they actually benefit the most disadvantaged part of society. Whether this solution is reason or rationalization is subject to discussion. All this is witness to the intricate psychology of the Democrat, a psychology of which we must be aware in order to know ourselves, and in which we are not likely to be aware without the help of significant thinkers who see us from the outside and judge us in terms of serious alternatives to democracy. Writers like Tocqueville, Burke, Plato. Insofar as this concerns me particularly, the charge of elitism reflects the moral temper of our regime, as the charge of atheism would have done in an earlier age. You couldn't get much of a response to you university today in saying that Mr. So-and-so doesn't believe in God. But you can get a lot of people worked up by saying that Mr. Bloom doesn't believe in equality. This tells us a lot about where things are at. It explains how tempting a career is offered to egalitarian tartuffery. It is not a very precise charge, and in comparison with the Ivy League, compare me to the Ivy League, I would have it worse to be called a moderate elitist. But persons other than those are now making the charge. Inasmuch as I am talking about the top 20 or so universities in the book, and I do not particularly quarrel with their mode of recruiting faculty and students, I suppose, with respect to who is taught, we are in agreement. The disagreement concerns what is done with those students, with the content of today's and tomorrow's elite education. What we are witnessing is, in fact, the introduction of a new, non-elitist, non-exclusionary system of education in the humanities and parts of the social sciences, and accompanying a program for the reform of the human understanding. This is an extremely radical project, which is made to appear mainstream by marching under the colors of all the movements towards a more equal society, which almost all Americans endorse. Therefore, we face a radicalism which is not recognized for what it is, and which can marshal these powerful and sometimes angry passions alongside of its own fanatic passions. It is into these massed phalanx that I march all along, not entirely innocently, but unaware of just how powerful it will become. And the response was, I suppose, predictable. Inasmuch as though I have always been in support of and a beneficiary of, we say, the movements towards practical equality in this country, very much a critic of the form of mind which is being proposed on us. For my sins, I have reaped an unabating whirlwind of abuse, unparalleled in my experience, except perhaps by Sartre's diatribes against his enemies and critics in Les Temps Modernes in the 40s and 50s. I suspect that this is the model for engagé critics like David Reef, the Times Literary Supplement, who think that my opinion stained my hands with the blood of the innocents in Nicaragua, Limassol, who calls me, in a striking reminder of our McCarthyite heritage, un-American. I always really in church right here. That Sartrean world was the conveyor belt for many of the views affecting us now. The peculiar savagery of the attacks on me may have escaped those of you who follow these things with less interest than I do. But people's angers teach much about what concerns them. Anger almost always disguises itself as moral indignation, and, as Aristotle teaches, is the only one of the passions that requires speech and reason to provide arguments which justify the passion, without which it is frustrated and withers. Anger is the proof of man's rationality, also issued book burning if the angry were not strongly constrained by power in society. God. Let me give you an example as reported by the New York Times. Headline: Minute of Hate at Chapel Hill. Academia's liberals defend their carnival of cannons against Bloom's killer bees. That's the headline. This is the first paragraph. In some respects, the scene in North Carolina last weekend recalled the daily Minute of Hatred, George Orwell's 1984, when the citizens are required to rise and hurl invective at pictures of a man known only as Goldstein, the great enemy of the state. Goldstein, at a conference on the future of liberal education sponsored by Duke University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, speaker after speaker denounced what they called the cultural conservatives, who, in the words of Duke English professor Stanley Fish, have mounted dyspeptic attacks on the humanities. There were no pictures of these cultural conservatives on the wall, but they were derided, scorned, laughed at. This group represents the current establishment of the humanities, literature, and research. I appreciate the Times making explicit for me the resemblance to Stalinist thought control. These professors are from hot institutions like Stanford, Duke, not to mention which have most openly dedicated themselves to the new educational dawn called openness. Dawn whose rosy fingers are currently wrapped tightly around the throat of the tradition in almost all universities. I want to talk about the meaning of this movement, what it is offering all of us. The attack on me brings it into focus. First, I feel constrained to say a word about myself, the intention of the book, which has caused such a stir for both my natural contours and those of the book have been disfigured by the critical barnacles which have been stuck on it and me. There is a desire to make me into something other than what I am, so that I can be more easily categorized in the mouth. In the first place, I am not a conservative, neither neo nor paleo. I say this not to curry favor in a setting where our kind of conservatism is out of favor. Conservatism is a respectable outlook, and one usually has to have some firmness of character to stick decently by what is so often unpopular. I just do not happen to be that animal. Any superficial reading of my book will show that I differ from the conservatives' positions, both theoretical and practical. Part of the reason is that my teachers, Socrates, Machiavelli, Rousseau, and Nietzsche, could hardly be called conservatives. All found beings are radical. Conservatism always has to be judged by the radical call for events, the consequences of which it intends to conserve. I did not, to use Marxist language, have to be considered an object of a liable right. It was the very favorable opinions of the book expressed by left liberals such as Tristan Howard, Richard Reeves, Robert Skidelsky, but that was before the word came down from the intellectual high command. The misunderstanding has something to do with the fact that I am also not in any current sense a liberal. The permanent human tendency is to doubt that the theoretical stance is authentic and suspect that it is only a covert attachment to a party, either going to be a Dodger or a Yankee style. Almost all those teachers I spoke about founded on this public suspicion. This tendency is much strengthened in our time, and philosophy itself is understood by its nature to be engagé, committed, the most extreme partisanship. Theory in this perspective looks pallid, weak, dishonest, whatsoever. I respect persons like Sidney Hook, who give the best of their energies to fighting threats to academic integrity. But that, unfortunately, is not me. I've always been pleased to hang around the fringes of the intellectual world and look in, and I'm continually surprised that I can support myself in that activity. Look, to attempt to change things would take me away from my natural activity, would delay gratification now for the sake of unsure futures. I suppose I do think that the most important thing is to think things through. I took this a statement as serious as I could make of our situation with respect to self-knowledge. Not in my wildest imagination did I think it would appeal to anyone but a few friends, potential friends, a few students, potential students. That would be a hit. The genial American hand to trade surface, not me. The prospect I described is publicly unendurable. And I was both criticized for not providing a cure and praised for having prescribed one. Perhaps a public debate about education is a good thing, but I am not, and have never been, a very active participant in that debate. My suspicion is that the confrontation with currently stronger forces only precipitates greater defeats for liberal education. I suppose I contributed to the mindless assertion of the importance of values, which both candidates in the recent election vied to make their own. But any study of my book would have shown that this chatter about values is only one more example of insignificant speech. Above all, I have avoided the exciting business of defending myself, parrying every thrust. I wish to avoid the self-absorption and corrosion I have seen in others with the principles of false solidity. Nietzsche's principle that if you look too long into the abyss, it looks back at you rings true. I have gotten a great kick out of becoming the academic equivalent of a rock star. This is partly because the eternal American child in me found it agreeable to experience peculiarly American success from the inside, find out whether I had been missing any. But mostly it was because I was afforded a close-up look at the closing of the American mind. I have had to learn, however, to be careful to avoid injury as it slams shut on me. To the extent I am passionately affected by the spectacle I describe in the book, it arouses sorrow or pity for young people whose horizon has become so dark and narrow that in this enlightened country it has begun to resemble a cave. Self-consciousness, self-awareness, that Delphic know thyself, seems to me to be the serious business of education. It is, I know, very difficult even to know what that means, let alone achieve it. But one thing is certain. One's head is crammed with ideas that were once serious, but have become cliches. If one does not even know that these cliches are not as natural as the sun and the moon, and if one has no notion that there are alternatives to those cliches, one is doomed to be the puppet of other people's ideas. Only the search back to the origin of one's ideas in order to see the real arguments for them, before people became so certain of them that they ceased thinking about them at all, and liberate us. Our study of history has taught us to laugh at the follies of the whole past, the monarchies, oligarchies, theocracies, and aristocracies, with their fanaticism for empire and salvation, which were once taken so seriously. But we have very few tools for seeing ourselves in the same way as others will see us. Each age always conspires to make its own way of thinking appear to be the only possible just way. And this is the age that has the least resistance to the triumph of its own way. less real presence of respectable alternative, less knowledge of the Titanic way. Moreover, we have historicism, which tells us we cannot resist one's own way, and relativism, which tells us what's the use in it. All this has the effect of out. To this extent, I have criticized doctrinaire, historicism, and relativism as threats to the self-awareness of those who honestly seek it. In my book, I point to the great sources of those serious ideas, which have become dogmas, and urge that we turn to serious study of them in order to purge ourselves of our dogmatism. For this I have been violently attacked as a nostalgic, an ideologue, a doctrinaire, etc., etc. The meaning is really, don't touch our belief structure, it hurts. We ought to know, on the basis of historical observation, that what epochs consider their greatest virtue is most often really their greatest temptation, vice, or danger. Roman manliness, Spanish piety, British class, German authenticity. We have to learn to put the scalpel to our virtues, for example, to our equality. Listen to Plato about the democratic man. He lives his life in accord with a certain equality of pleasures he has established, to whichever one happens along, as though it were chosen by the lot. He hands over the rule within himself until it is satisfied, and then again to another, dishonoring none, but fostering them all on the basis of equality. He doesn't admit speech or let it pass into the guardhouse if someone says there are some pleasures belonging to fine and good desires and some belonging to bad desires, and that the ones must be practiced and honored and the others checked and enslaved. Rather, he shakes his head at all this and says that all are alike must be honored on equal basis. Plato suggests here, if you're born in a democracy, you're likely to be a relativist. It goes with the territory. Relativism may be true, but since you are by birthright inclined to relativism, you especially better think it over. Not for the sake of good morals, good social order, at least in any usual sense of those terms, for the sake of your freedom and your self-awareness. I addressed the issue of relativism here, in this room, 4 years ago, reading what was to become the first chapter of Those Living Mine, speaking of it under its currently reputable name, openness. I have since learned with what moral fervor it is protected, and its opposite ethnocentrism attacked. This fervor does not propose an investigation, or crusade. The very idea that we ought to look for standards by which to judge ourselves is naughty. There has been a more or less successful attempt to remove my views from respectable discourse. You simply have to believe in the current understanding of openness and believe in democracy and be a decent person. Probably the stupidest assessment of the book was by Joel Conroy, president of the Guggenheim Foundation. And he was competing in a crowded field. He was, however, about par in the civility contest. He said that it is an ill-tempered, ill-argued, ill-written book, which he sincerely hoped would soon be completely forgotten. He manifestly had not read a line of the book, not so rare I've discovered with critics. Instead, he strung together insults drawn from easily identifiable reviews emanating from the Ivy League New York axis. He concluded by ridiculing me for not simply accepting that all cultures are equal on the eve of what he called the century of the Pacific. This formulation set my imagination in motion. I decided it might be interesting to make a Gulliver's Travel to Japan, which for a variety of reasons has caught America's attention. We might see whether we really want to have our mark, or we really want to set our mark in the great Pacific with a relativist compass without an ethnocentric life champion. maybe you're too young to remember the old slogan of the Navy, which was "Join the Navy." That's actually very funny if you roll it like that. When we arrive on the shores of Japan, we shall see a thriving nation. Its success clearly has something to do with its society, which asks much of itself and gets it. It is a real community. Its members have roots. Japanese society is often compared to a family. These characteristics are in tune with much of current liberal thought in America. You have to remember Governor Cuomo's keynote address at the Democratic Convention in 1984, where he suggested, I believe, President no longer called President the Father. But let us look at the flip side of this coin. Japanese society is intransigently homogeneous, barring the diversity which is the great pride of the United States today. To put it brutally, the Japanese are unabashedly racist. They consider themselves superior. They resist the immigrants who have the most crying need for succor. They systematically exclude even the Koreans who have lived for generations among them. Above all, they despise blacks so openly that they have difficulty restraining cabinet officers from explaining that America's failing economy is due to blacks. And that candor can create serious international incidents. This view, I gather, is extended to the policies of the Indian classes in the United States. Are we to open ourselves up to this new culture, sympathize with its tastes? Should we aim for restrictiveness rather than diversity? Should we experiment with a more effective racism? All these things could be understood as part of our interest in keeping up with the Japanese economic territory. Or they could, in a tonier vein, give help in our search for unity and roots. We recoil in horror from even having such thoughts. But how can we legitimate our calling? Is our acculturation excess baggage brought with us on such voyages of discovery? Inasmuch as there are no transcultural transcultural values, our reaction is ethnocentric. And the one thing we know absolutely is that ethnocentrism is bad. We have painted ourselves into a corner. It's important. Those who shrug off such difficulties fail to recognize how important it is to have justice in addition to feeling on our side. Without it, we shall soon succumb to some dangerous temptations, and have perhaps already begun to do so. Many such lessons are to be learned on future voyages to the non-Western world. Discovery requires courage and resoluteness, as Heidegger would teach. I wonder whether those who use this language are aware of what he means when he says that one has to face storms in the ocean and on. When little children speak of how bad ethnocentrism is, I hear it all the time from our 13, 14. I know that they have been propagandized. It is too complicated for them to understand. Condemning ethnocentrism is, of course, frequently a sign of intellectual, though not necessarily moral, progress. But it is only a first step. To recognize that some of the things our culture believes are not true imposes on us the duty, much more difficult to fulfill, of finding out which are true and which are not. Business altogether more difficult than wholesale jettisoning of all that one thought one knew. Such jettisoning always ends up practical, with selective and thoughtless return to old ethnocentric ideas on the basis of what one needs right now, what pleases one. Travel, one must spend a little time thinking about one's compass, as well as the land one wishes to reach. The project of reforming the mind in the name of openness, an educational project, has gained strength in the last couple of years, and is succeeding in changing the curriculum all over the country. Changes as great as any of the 60s, but not nearly so noticeable accepted, now apparently so obviously right. From the slogans and the arguments echoed so frequently in the universities today, in the press, one can judge the intentions of reform and what is at stake in present debate. The key word is canon. And we might say that what we are witnessing is the quarrel of the canons. The 20th century's version of the 17th century's quarrel between the ancients and moderns. The greatest document of which is Swift's Battle of the Books. Would that he were here to describe ours as he described theirs. The issue is what food best nourishes the hungers of young souls. The canon is the newly valued, demagogically intended expression for the books taught and read by students as the core of formal education. As soon as one adopts the term, as both sides have, foolishly so for those who have not to Shakespeare not, the nature of the debate is therefore determined. For canon means what is established by authority, by the powers, hence not by criteria that are rationally defensible. The debate shifts from the content of books to how they became powerful. The motives for which they are used. Canons are, by definition, instruments of domination. They are there to be overthrown, deconstructed in the name of liberation. Those who seek empowerment, that's a hot new word, years on. It's going to be used in political affairs that weren't used 5-6 years ago. No, something has changed. I would suggest that as the civil rights movement produced the quest for rights, Black Power movement and others produced the quest for empowerment. Those who seek empowerment must overcome the prevailing canon, which is the main source of their enslavement. Curiously, in all of this, books are invested with a very great significance in all this. They are the causes, not mere epiphenomena as Marxism. Change the books, not the ownership of the means of production. And you change the world. Readers of the world, you have nothing to lose but your canon. The language is the language of power. Philosophy is the most spiritualized will to power. That is Nietzsche. As is more or less all the current talk about the canon. It's all about power, and in a more metaphysical sense than most know. Philosophy in the past was about knowing. Now it is about power. This is the source of the deep drama being played out so frivolously all around us. Intellectual life, the struggle of wills to power. Edward Said said at Stanford that the new university reforms were the triumph of postmodernism, meaning, among other things, that the curriculum which taught that the theoretical life is biased has been overcome. Underlying the discussion about non-Western content, as it is today, is a discussion among Westerners using entirely Western categories about the decline or the end of the West. The suicide of the West is, by definition, accomplished by Western hands. To get the flavor of the public discussion, a couple more quotes from the New York Times report. The Hate Conference, referring to me. The conference's participants denounced what they said was a narrow, outdated, like to the Israel May, Madame Bovary, everybody says to the end of the whole thing was outdated. You've got to keep up with the times. It was a narrow, outdated interpretation of the humanities and of culture itself. One based, they frequently pointed out, on works written by dead, white, European males. Above all, the campaign is against what we call Eurocentrism. The article continues. The message of the North Carolina conference was that American society has changed too much for this view to prevail any longer. Blacks, women, Latinos, and homosexuals are demanding recognition for their own canons. I don't exactly know which of the canons groups up, but quote, this is a larger projects like those of Ben and Herschel Bloom all look back to the recovery of the earlier vision as he closed the conception of an ethnic carnival or festival of cultures, ways of life and customs, Professor Fish said. This is the positive education project. Replace the old cold Greek temple by an Oriental bazaar. It might also be called the Chicago politics model. Overthrow the waspocracy by means of a rainbow coalition. Empower the minorities and the women. This has more or less plausibility as a political strategy. Whether it should be the polar star in the formation of young minds is a question. It promises continuing the wondrous curricular variations as different specialties and groups vie for power. I would need the pen of Flaubert here to address this quote. I'm grateful to Professor Fish for formulating the new project so This is the popular service. Publicly acceptable principle that everyone's getting a piece of the action. A nation that has bought into politics. The deeper, stronger, and more revealing side is stated in the article as follows. The conference buzzed with code words. When the speakers talked about the hegemonic culture, they meant undemocratic domination by white men. The scholars particularly scorned the idea that certain great works of literature have absolute value or represent some eternal truth. Just about everything, they argued, is an expression of race, class, or gender. This is academic jargon, one-third Marxist, two-thirds ancient. But in our academized political discourse, it points toward the metaphysics of the cosmic power struggle with which we interpret everything nowadays. All books have to be reinterpreted to find the conscious or unconscious power of the motive. As Nietzsche put it, every philosophy is the author's secret culture. To illustrate the contending ways of approaching books, I've selected two quotes. The first is the voice of W.E.B. Du Bois at the turn of the century. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces at me. Across the color line, I walk arm in arm with Balzac. Her smiling men and welcoming women lie in gilded halls. From out the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the trace-moving stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius. What soul I will. They all come graciously. No scorn. So with truth I dwell there. I confess that this view is most congenial to me. I've always found our common transcultural humanity not in a canon, but in certain books from which you learn about the self. Great strength in this lonely journey. We found community rather than war. We used books to think about a situation, moving beyond personal prejudice to independence and non-dignity. So he recapitulates the ever-renewed experience of books with religion, addressing persons seeking their way out. The second quote is from the president of the Black Student at Stanford. It dates from a year ago during the Stanford curriculum. The message of Western civilization is nigger go home. Du Bois, from this perspective, has suffered from false consciousness, deceptive faith, theoretical liberation, no exit. These quotes truly reflect the meaning of debate and frame itself has religious overtones. Rhetorically, it arouses our passion for liberation and authority. The canon, of course, is the list of books of the Bible accepted by the Catholic Christian Church as genuine, inspired. These books are supported to propel our faith, or are supposed to propel our faith, without reason or evidence. This kind of pseudo-religious characterization of practically everything is epidemic in the post-Christian world. Period. God is dead. He is the only founder. This generates all kinds of abstract words like charisma, which determine our perspective on the phenomenon before we even look at it. Hard opinion and power is the only thing we need to as well as political. With respect to canon in particular, the curriculum is treated as the means of indoctrination used by a ruling elite, and study is the process of entitlement for entry into that elite, for distinguishing the dominators from the dominated. In other words, priests teach the canon. These professors like me are empowered by the canon. They protect their privileged position by their teaching. They establish the canon and are established by it. So you see why a professor like me defends the canon so ferociously. I can go on and on, leaving these wells of fantasy endlessly. Of course, there is an element of truth in it, the one that mistakes accident for essence and absolutizes insight in such a way as to distort the phenomenon beyond regulation. Obviously, books are used by nations and religions to support their way, and to train the young to that way. That is not the whole story. Many, perhaps the most important books, have an independent status and bring us light from outside of our behavior, without which we would be blind. Books are frequently the acid which reveals the outlines of abuse of power. This is especially true in a liberal society like our own, where it's hard to find a canonical book which truly supports our way. It is at least as plausible for books which have a continuing good reputation and used to be read in college, have made it by their intrinsic merit. Again, and obviously, traditions tend to ossify, also to aggregate superfluous matters, taught authoritatively by tiresome persons who don't know why they are important, who hold their jobs because they are virtuoso and trivial. But this only means that the traditions have to be renewed from time to time. The professors made to give account of themselves. One of the most obvious cases of the use of a writer as an authority to bolster what might be called structure and power is Aristotle during the Christian Middle Ages. Scholasticism was a stifling force which had to be rebelled against in order to free mind. But to take that Will Durant-like interpretation as exhaustive would be naive. In the first place, Aristotle was quite something of his own. He survived the wreckage of scholasticism quite nicely, and needed no such structure prior to that time or afterward to ensure the continuing interest of like men and women taking his works. Moreover, such an interpretation tends to cover over the fascinating story of Aristotle's coming to be within Christianity. The fact is that Aristotle's succession to power was a result of a revolution in Christianity, which rationalized Christianity and made it move a long way from revelation toward reason. It was the first explosion of Greek philosophy into Christian Europe. That philosophy had been preserved and renewed among the Muslim Arabs. The challenge of reason presented by the Muslim philosophers precipitated a crisis in Christianity, a crisis that was appeased but not entirely resolved by Thomas Aquinas. It was not a crisis caused by arms, but the introduction of the power of Aristotle's ideas. Aristotle sat among the Christian sages for a time, but he inspired many to turn against those sages. Such cases speak Western male canon. I think it is a grave error to accept that the words concerned are essentially Western, or essentially any of those other words. Certainly the defenders of what we have usually read, cut the ground out from under their own feet when they defend the classic books as Western, alleging we have to know our own tradition, the West, produce moral what we need, or the West is superior, or what have you. I have certainly never spoken that way, although I read it about myself all the time in the newspapers, including that article I just quoted. The fact that I am doubtful about the non-Western craze denotes automatically, even to sympathetic critics, that I am promoting Western civ. The very language used shows how enslaved we have become to Nestorius' assertion that all thought is decisively cultured. The specific claims of Plato or Kant are that they speak to all men everywhere and forever. And I see no reason a priori to throw those claims out of court. That is precisely what is done when you're taken to be parts of Western civ, or Westerns. To the extent that they are just that, the appeals against them are justified, for they represent what is admittedly partial. The strength of these appeals is in their demand for wholeness, completeness of understanding. Historicism is precisely what has to be called into question, and it's one of those things that has so completely captured modern minds that it appears indubitable. The quarrel is not, I repeat, is not about Western and non-Western, but about the possibility of philosophy. The real issue is being obscured to a political dispute. If we give in, we shall allow a very modern philosophy to swallow up, leaving not a morsel to whet appetites, all philosophers from Socrates up to and including Marx. Postmodernism is an attempt to annihilate the inspiration of Greek philosophy, more effective than that of the barbarians with their Dark Ages after the fall of Rome. More effective because it is being accomplished by the forces and the guile of philosophy itself. I am not asserting the truth of philosophy's old claim, but I am asserting that that is the only question. It's neither a Western or a non-Western question. Nobody, or practically nobody, argues that natural science is essentially Western. Some efforts have been made in that direction, just as some feminists have tried to show that it's essentially male. But these efforts, aside from their admirable sense of the need for theoretical consistency, have not proved persuasive. There it is, that big rock transcultural knowledge of truth, natural science, standing amidst us while we chatter on about the cultural basis of all learning. A serious non-Western push would require that students learn 50% non-Western math, 50% non-Western physics, 50% non-Western biology, and so forth for medicine and engineering. The reformers stop there because they know they would smack up against a stone wall and discredit their whole movement. Philosophy, they say, is not likely. Perhaps, but I have yet to see a serious discussion about wherein it differs. Differ it does, but qualitatively. That question ought to keep us busy for a time. Science is surely somehow transcultural. Religion seems pretty much limited to cultures, even to define it. Is philosophy like science, or is it like religion? What we are witnessing is an attempt to drag it away definitively from religion. Practically, the universities have dealt with this problem by seeding despised and historicized humanities to the political activists and extremists, leaving their non-historicized disciplines, which is where the meat and the big bucks are, undisturbed. It is a windfall for administrators to be able to turn over all the affirmative action complaints to the humanities, which act as a lightning rod while their ship continues its stately progress over undisturbed waters. Stanford shows its concerned, humane, radical face to its inner community, and its serious, technical face to the outside community, particularly to its donors. The humanities radicals settle for this on the calculation that they can control the minds of the young, they will ultimately gain political control over the power of the sciences. Now, in final response to the canon of pictures, I would argue that the essential liberating texts have lived because they are useful. When I spoke of democracy and relativism, I said only what I learned from Plato. Well, I appreciate and need further information. So do we all. The serious scholars in non-Western thought should bring to us the powerful texts they know of to help us on this question. The true canon aggregates around the most urgent questions we as human beings face. That is the only ground for the study of books. Idle cultural reports, Eastern or Western, cannot truly concern us except as a hobby. Edgar Friedenberg once said that social scientists are always giving themselves hernias to see something about America Tocqueville did not see. That is why we need Tocqueville, and our neglecting to read him can only be interpreted as never the hernia for which. Nietzsche surely did not seek out Socrates because he was part of the classical canon German boys learned in school. It was in spite of that fact. Socrates was necessary to him as the profoundest statement of what philosophy is, and as the worthiest of rivals for himself. No Socrates, no Nietzsche. Similarly, Machiavelli was compelled by real need, not by some performance, when he sought out Xenophon, for what reason? Male, female, black, white, Greek, barbarian. That was all indifferent, as it should be. Nietzsche reflected on Buddha when he wanted to test the principle of contradiction. That is a model of the way things should be. The last thing we need is to hope up a sort of philosophic United Nations for the sake of representation for all peoples. Each must ultimately judge for himself from a good beginning to see to what other thinkers the peoples we attract in return. That will quickly lead to the common. There are very few remaining publicly recognized each other. There is no conspiracies, only the desire to know. If we allow ourselves to be seduced by the plausible theses of our day, and turn our backs on the great dialogue, our loss will be irreparable. This view is what will give more than the powers of our day. Anyone who defends that those powers fall to the West is automatically eligible for admission to the elitist, sexist, racist club. I must end. I had one that would give us some few words, discussing another intimately related aspect of my work, which is around means criticism. That is my characterization of the elements in the 60s movies as fascism. It seems to some that I am one of those persons who trivialize evil by calling anyone whom I don't like a fascist or Nazi. That is not what I did. I did not call persons active in the 60s those names. I said that the language of the New Left was no longer truly Marxist and become imbued with the vision of fascism. And that I will not only stick by, but reassert even more vigorously than I did in the book. Anyone with an ear who knows the speech of intellectuals in Weimar Germany will hear its echoes all around us. Echoes of the dangerous ideas to which the Weimar Germans became accustomed. I've alluded to some of them tonight. Since the publication of the closing of the American Mind, fortuitously there has been fresh attention paid to the Nazism of Martin Heidegger, more and more openly recognized as the most intelligent figure contributing to the postmodernism. At the same time, Paul the Man, who introduced deconstructionism, which is fairly well similar to Heidegger, Paul the Man, who introduced deconstructionism to the U.S. was revealed to have written as a young man, pro-Nazi activism, revolutionism. The lively debate around these questions has not been very helpful, for it's focused more on the questions of personal guilt than on the possible relation of thought itself to foulness and political extremism. The fact that the man had become a leftist doesn't do a thing. He never seems to have passed through a stage where he was attracted by reason or liberal democracy. I must leave it to saying that those who chose to mulch, as their fundamental category, starting from power set that immoderation, violence, blood, and soil are its means. Inclined to take the views of men of such stature seriously. Very few Americans and the West people are attracted by these aspects of popular culture, although there are some, I suspect, who experience terrible frisson of joy. However that may be, one always ends up paying a price, the consequences of what we think. It is in this atmosphere, the awareness that we tread near the edge of the abyss, that I think I write. The scene is bleak and ominous. It certainly provides great intellectual exploration if one dare observe closely.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hardly know where to begin. Professor Bloom and I had another encounter. I think it was last May, 6 months ago at Rutgers. And I hope that he didn't think of characterizing that as peculiar savagery. I apologize to him in advance for having to use some of the material that I used at that time. He's heard some of it before, but I think it remains valid. Though I must say today, Professor Bloom talked more about himself than he did at Rutgers. That is probably the development of fame. Professor Bloom is appalled at being called an elitist, especially by people at Harvard who feel guilty. I'm not sure that that's really so. I mean, as usual, he does not supply many citations. In fact, his book is not full of footnotes for many of the kind of accusations and obits edicta that are scattered throughout the book. I see a veritable battalion of straw men and straw women. One of my favorite examples, and I apologize for using it, Alan, because I know that everybody always uses it, but it's a marvelous example from his book, because I did do some empirical research on this subject, is a passage in which he says young people know that rock is the beat of sexual intercourse. By the way, in my day, it was the tango. That is why he goes on. Ravel's Bolero is the one piece of classical music that is commonly known and liked by them. Them are people, I suppose, under 21. I tried to do some empirical investigation, and I wrote to a number of friends of mine, and I received the following letter from the Vice Chancellor of the University of Indiana in Indianapolis. He said, I interviewed my teenage children, who are both contemporary rock music lovers, and have found that they are only vaguely familiar with and do not like Ravel's Bolero. He said, I hope this does not suggest some sexual dysfunction. You do get the sense that Professor Bloom complains of abuse, but that he's laughing all the way to the bank while complaining this way. Some of what he said, I think, borders on the fanciful. I think what he said about Japan, it must be a put-on. I mean, do we study Western civilization, our own civilization, simply in terms of all their most negative characteristics? And should we stop studying German history or German civilization because it produced Nazis? This hysteria about the study of non-Western culture seems to suggest as if that's all that we are asking our students to do. I mean, I frankly don't see that the Stanford episode was nearly as significant as some have tried to make it. It is certainly true that Plato is more than Western, but it's equally true that Confucius is more than non-Western, and that the Tale of Genji is more than just another Japanese novel. It also contains verities and thoughts that are applicable for all time, and I think in all civilizations. And I think one would have to admit that these sources have not received nearly the attention that they deserve simply on intellectual grounds. Now, Professor Bloom said that he is accused of being nostalgic, and I think, in fact, that there is a strain of nostalgia in what he says. And in order to highlight that, because he said himself, people used to read other books, people had different beliefs. The intent is to show that our own time somehow is a time of retrogression. I want to quote to you from a commencement speech that was in fact delivered at Harvard in 1936 by the great philosopher John Buchan, author of the 39 Steps and one-time Governor General of Canada. And this is what he had to say. On one thing we shall all be agreed. I am speaking to a gathering of alumni, of former students, and we must regretfully confess to each other that the great day of Harvard is over. The great day of every university on the globe is over. At some date about 40 years ago, a golden age dawned on the world. Its beginning coincided with the appearance in Cambridge of the older members here today. In that age, life was more interesting than it can ever have been before. Men were bolder and more humorous. Friendship was a richer and warmer thing. The world was a succulent oyster waiting to be opened. Let some new Gibbon explain how the decline began. The subject is too painful for those who have suffered from it. It is sufficient to say that brightness has fallen from the air and the twilight of the gods descended. The few good men who are left from that time are now like Falstaff, fat and growing old, but at any rate they keep some rags of decency about them and are determined to testify to unbelievers of the great era in which they once lived. I am sure there is no one here today, however pitiless his optimism, who will deny that since we ceased to be undergraduates, civilization has most grievously declined. Well, I don't believe that. I don't believe it because I don't believe that the issue is a matter of equality achieved, let us say, through affirmative action. I think the real issue is that in those good old days, many individuals who were fully qualified, equal by any imaginable standard, were systematically excluded from the universities and from many other of the good things that our society had to offer. I think that one way of looking at liberal education is to borrow the words of Mr. von Nostrand, who wrote a book about the subject many years ago, and who said it is understanding the nature of things according to the best knowledge of our time. Now, what does that mean? I think it means taking into account the growth of knowledge, and that is growing very rapidly. I think it should take into account the fact that more and more people will engage, I think, in a lifetime of education. It is said that people now have, 3 careers, 7 jobs. I think it's particularly important for women, more and more of whom have professional lives, but at certain times have to leave their professional careers for a period of time and then re-enter. And according to the best knowledge of our time, I think means that things do change, not equally in all areas, to be sure. I think Professor Bloom will concede science. I don't think it is necessarily the most efficient way to study science by, reading the original experiments, let's say, of Newton or other great scientists in the past. There may be better ways. I also, clearly this is also true in the social sciences. It may be less true in the humanities, although I would imagine that each age has its own interpretations, and I don't think that the interpretations of today are necessarily invalid. I might as well confess one other thing, and I say it with a considerable frisson. Is that the word I'm looking for? There is no perfect curriculum. I am a relativist. Here I stand, I can do no other. I think that there are many ways to achieve the goal of an educated person, of a liberally educated person. And I think that I have no objection to many of Professor Bloom's ideas. I think, for example, he didn't today talk so much about a great book curriculum, but I think a great book curriculum is a perfectly wonderful approach for some people. It is obviously not very good for everybody, judging by the results. But as I say, I don't think that perfection exists here. I think there are. Did I misspeak or something? Oh, I see. Well, maybe you misspoke, yes. I want to conclude by reading you one more passage, because I think it lays an emphasis on certain aspects of education that were not stressed by Professor Bloom today. I don't think that he would disagree with them necessarily, but I think it places a certain emphasis on a very important point that is much too much forgotten in American universities, particularly in the top American universities. I want to quote you a passage that's become very well known in recent years from an Eton master spoken in 1861 to a group of Eton students in Britain, so somewhat over 100 years ago. And this is what he had to say. You are not engaged so much in acquiring knowledge as in making mental efforts under criticism. A certain amount of knowledge you can indeed with average faculties acquire so as to retain. Nor need you regret the hours that you have spent on much that is forgotten, for the shadow of lost knowledge at least protects you from many illusions. But you go to a great school not for knowledge so much as for arts and habits, for the habit of attention, for the art of expression, for the art of assuming at a moment's notice a new intellectual posture, for the art of entering quickly into another person's thoughts, for the habit of submitting to censure and refutation, for the art of indicating assent or dissent in graduated terms, for the habit of regarding minute points of accuracy, for the habit of working out what is possible in a given time, for taste, for discrimination, for mental courage and mental soberness. Above all, you go to a great school for self-knowledge. Thank you.
Can one conceive of something to say about Alan Bloom's view of the American university that he hasn't already heard? Setting aside the perhaps undiscussable differences in what we each saw in our students of the 60s, I find two regions in which Bloom's experience and mine differ systematically that are specific and clear enough to be stated briefly, perhaps useful. First, our experience of the position of philosophy in the intellectual economy we were presented with in the 2 decades prior to the 60s. And second, our experience of the modern and the popular in the arts. My citing of these differences can only prove worthwhile, however, against a background of agreement I find with his work over the centrality of a cluster of issues, of which I specify 5. A first agreement concerns the illustriousness, in Emerson's sense, of the university in the life of a democracy. A second concerns the irreplaceability of great books, what Thoreau calls scriptures, in, let's call it, a humanistic or liberal education. A third concerns the unaware imbibing of European thought by a chronically unprepared American constitution, a condition that is as live for us, or should be, as when Emerson was founding American thinking by demonstrating his knack of inheriting by transfiguring European philosophy. The fourth moment of agreement concerns the goal of a democratic university education as keeping open the idea of philosophy as a way of life, call it the life of the mind, a name for which might be called moral perfectionism. Bloom speaks of the longing for completeness. Emerson speaks instead of a capacity for partiality and of the courage to become. Both see in the goal the desire for the world's human possibilities, and both are aware that the aspiration is always threatening to turn into a debased narcissism or foolish imitation. The fifth sense of my agreement with Bloom concerns the threat that a discourse about such issues, such as the prose fashion in Bloom's book, manifestly the product of a lifetime of reading and of a devotion to teaching, is becoming unintelligible to the culture that has produced it, and not alone to the young, in my experience less to them than to others. The first region of difference I cite is that of our experience on entering the university in the 40s and then teaching in the 50s. Bloom describes his first look at what he calls the popularization of German philosophy in the United States, which yielded, for example, ideas of value relativism and value positive, as follows. It's his description. When I came to the University of Chicago in the mid-40s, terms like value judgment were fresh, confined to an elite and promising special insight. There were great expectations in the social sciences. The new era was beginning in which man and society would be understood better than they ever have been understood before. The academic character of the philosophy departments, with their tired and tiresome methodology and positivism, had caused people interested in the perennial and live questions about man to migrate to the social sciences. There were two writers who dominated and generated real enthusiasm, Freud and Weber. Entering those philosophy departments in the late 40s, after an undergraduate major in music, I seemed to see something quite different. That the popularization of German-speaking positivism, linking up with certain strains in native pragmatism, was absorbing the intellectual conscience of a significant face of social science, as well as of academic psychology, along with absorbing thinking about morality and religion and the arts, creating a climate in which the question is not whether value positing can express the dedication to the life of the mind, but whether judgments of value can be said to have any intellectual content at all. And in which intelligence is expressed not in discussing which the most interesting writers are and how most strongly to be challenged by them, but in which the reading of texts, any, great books or small, has something like the status of a hobby in comparison with the serious business of analyzing and solving the problem. But that is philosophy, too, however unhappy this version of it. The distrust of reading is half of the philosophical spirit. The devotion to thinking by reading, however great the books in question, will not count in my corner of things as a philosophical devotion unless it knows at each moment how to distrust reading. Emerson's and Thoreau's cautions against the reading of books reveals no intellectual innocence, but their philosophical seasoning. The highest instance of this half of the philosophical spirit in the opening half of the present century is Wittgenstein, Heidegger's exact contemporary, and I suppose his philosophical equal, at least. The fact of this division of the philosophical spirit, roughly equatable with the split between the English-speaking and the German-speaking traditions of philosophy, is for me the dominant condition of the possibility of philosophy now, the signal opportunity of philosophizing in this nation in particular. It is a mark of the tradition represented in Heidegger's thought that it functions according to the myth of having read essentially everything, and that of Wittgenstein's according to the myth of having read essentially nothing. I do not say that a philosophical distrust of reading is the same as the refusal or incomprehension of reading which Bloom so deplores in recent American students. What I suggest is that the persistent unwillingness of American culture to who recognize the split in the spirit of philosophy has incomparably more to do with the present state of the American university than anything our students did in the 60s. It is, I think, Bloom's dismissal of the importance of the American university's drastic reception of positivism and his neglect of Wittgenstein's counterpoise at once to that positivism as well as to Heidegger's achievement that allows Bloom to burlesque the significance of Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions and of Rawls' theory of justice. Kuhn's book, whatever its shortcomings, for example, about the epistemology of what a world is and what the change of the world is, and however much its fame has overshadowed its teaching, did more than any other text to weaken the hold of a positivist pragmatist verificationist picture of scientific progress on the academic imagination, losing its hold. And whatever one's misgivings about Rawls' book, in particular perhaps about what he says about moral perfectionism, Bloom's idea of Rawls, as in Bloom's words, writing hundreds of pages to persuade men and proposing a scheme of government that would force them not to despise anyone, is too wild for fun. Rawls is trying to make plain and common, I cannot doubt that Bloom recognizes this, and how would it hurt him, what he wants? That our despising, I say Rawls' attempt is to make plain, that our despising someone is not a ground for depriving him of liberty or his deal of equality. It's a proposition that utilitarianism was unable to make plain, and in doing more than any work to challenge the reign of utilitarianism in academic moral philosophy, Rawls at the same time made the reading of what Bloom calls old books imperative for moral philosophy. It would not become one with my commitments to fail to mention a second region of difference between Bloom's experience and mine, that containing phenomena of movie viewing and of popular music as vehicles or of challenges to philosophy in these years. I confine myself to one of Bloom's passing observations. He says, in the Soviet Union, they're dependent on operas from the bad old days, because tyranny prevents artistic expression. We are dependent on the same operas, he goes on, because the thirsts that produced artistic need have been slaked. Well, as elsewhere, I'm uncertain of the attitude in these words. Is Bloom claiming that no significant operas have been or are being composed in America, or that the recognized masterpieces in this medium, written, say, since 1917, receive too few performances here? Apart from citing details, this apparent call for more culture or for more genuine culture sounds like a general grudge against the modern, something confirmed in Bloom's remarks about abstract painting and in his description of Louis Armstrong belting out Kurt Weill, which is a description that accords Armstrong none of his virtuosic irony nor any capacity to comprehend and challenge Kurt Weill's pathos. And it comes out in those pages in which Bloom takes Woody Allen's Zelig to represent the world of cinema and then reads the film as a popularization of German philosophy, rather than recognizing it as a direct engagement with Emerson's madly underinterpreted problematic of conformity and self-reliance, against which Woody Allen proposes a study of the relation between character and actor in the medium of film. No doubt, there has been a shift in our institutions of performance. In part, this is a function of the American universities having become a center and sustainer of the arts. Let us grant that opera does not play the social role it did in the bad old days. On what ground does Bloom regret this, if he does? He cites Plato's theory of music to lament the young's absorption in rock music. But I do not have to remind the translator of Rousseau, as well as of Plato, that Plato's theory of music would at least as surely condemn the representations of Don Giovanni and of Falstaff. I wonder what Bloom would think of the proposition, justified theoretically to my mind, and suggested thematically in movies from Mr. Deeds Goes to Town in 1936 to last year's Moonstruck, that opera has not mostly died, but mostly has become film, that film is our opera. That the majority of films are largely worthless is irrelevant, so are the majority of books. That no film is as good as Don Giovanni or Falstaff is also irrelevant. Very little of anything is that good. point of this speculation is that the relation between low and high culture, their access to one another, is definitively different in America from their relation in Europe, a fact ungraspable, say, by Adorno. As is the difference in America in the relation between philosophy and literature. These can seem, they can be, vulgar confusions. I find them also, and increasingly, untold encouragements. A parting word about Bloom's vision of the young with their Walkmans on, which he reads as deafening them to, in his words, what the great tradition has to say. It may be so, but maybe it is to be read as they're blocking out our opinions of what they listen to. I do not share the pleasures here. I take it that I'm not meant to. I'm meant not to. The young on this reading feel that there are times and places in which, in their solitude, they are not answerable to others, just like us. Thank you.
Brief response by Professor Bloom, and then we'll go to questions.
Just 2 sentences. I have to restate my faith in Louis Armstrong. That's what accompanied my puberty, as opposed to the Beatles. And the line in question, I think, was something to do with Louis Armstrong was seeing Kurt Weill, who was repeating a passage from Nietzsche's Suspect Zarathustra. And I felt that Armstrong was aware of that. And therefore was carrying these kinds of messages, popularizations of Weimar in the United States had nothing to do with the devaluing of Louis Armstrong. Secondly, I would only want to respond to Professor Rosofsky. I mean, there's much, I'm sure, has a permanent dialogue, but the issue was Japan. It's not I never suggested that we should not study non-Western things. Long tradition, there's a serious studies of those things. I was talking about the mode of argument, the use of those things. Of course, one doesn't have to take the negative aspects, but one has to know they're negative. And my argument is more around considering they're negative. That's my true. Well, I was looking for a youthful respondent.
Agreeing with much of what you said, most of what you said, and this troubles me. It makes me wonder whether you weren't pulling your punches. And so the question is this: you talked about educational reforms of liberal education that partake of relativism, that are implicated in the clothing of the American mind. And you attacked Stanford and Duke and someone called Fish. But sitting next to you is one of the great architects of one of the most famous recent reforms of liberal education, Dean Rosofsky. It's the 10th anniversary of this reform. And I would have thought, given the brave way you began attacking Harvard for thinking it wasn't elitist, or attacking you for being elitist, that you would be brave enough to say whether you thought Dean Rosofsky's reform participated in the closing of the American mind or avoided it.
No. I insist I'm fearless at Harvard. I come out as a paladin and so on. And in spite of the brave Henry who would oppose me, the great knight Henry, I somehow can't go into the details of all the liberal education programs. I was thinking about fundamental arguments affecting liberal education, no matter what the programs are. In Chicago's Great Books program, of course they contain the great books, but now it's all feminist third world critique. Those books were racist, sexist, elitist, and so that I think is the fundamental thing. My understanding of that reform is just as weird was that he did not say the question of political issues was the life. He left it very much too specialized. That was my view. So now I know we can argue back and forth, but I think that some or other, whatever goes, I think there are many ways to skin a cat. That's the reason I use the great books that I coloring for it. Very carefully, all kinds of criticisms of this. Lots of explanation, but simply as an indication of modes that have been appealing and that preserve our self-awareness. I think, for example, school substitutes for great books, that's all very, very nice. And it sounds vague and nice, but I don't think American citizens should not have read the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Federalist. Without that, I think that's for everyone. They don't know what kind of regime they're living in. Well, when you say like that, I think I can go on with a whole variety of such things that which we're all dependent, and maybe some Americans shouldn't and couldn't. But there's something problematic if they do not living within this regime, discussing and so on and so on politically. I mean, it doesn't mean to say they have to swallow it, but they just have to be aware of it. The kind of arguments, and I felt that program. I do feel very much constrained by time, so full, witty, destructive. But he is much more, I think, by nature. I mean, a very large-minded, but characterologically more of a specialist than I am. I got no trade, and I think that the program does that come kind of a response? I don't know what you want from me. I mean, I can't give a detailed criticism, but I think it is a kind of continuation of each of the specialties providing their introductory course. Some courses in this are excellent. The one you teach, I know it's classic, but when others teach in it, that's what we want. But let me see. I think he would have made his way with any course. Yeah. But okay. Was there something? What did you want to know? I want to be accurate. I mean, I think there are programs which reflect major question. I think this one does not as such. I do not. I think the closing of the mind is connected with political dogmatism around cultural relativism. What I can see, he did not promote that. Okay? Sure.
One reason it's an improvement, by the way, is that our senior faculty has gone back to teaching many of these courses, which they weren't doing before. The issue is not only what we teach, about which there may be some quarrel, but also, for example, the fact that our faculty for 2.5 years, talked about serious educational issues. Usually, faculties talked about nonsense, right? I mean, parking, this problem, that problem, whether or not a hotel should be built. But we talked about serious educational issues, and people really disagreed very profoundly. It's a debate that you would have respected. The outcome may not have satisfied you totally, but in that sense, I think that is also very much part of education, just as much as reading lists or specifics that are required. That's the only point.
I must admit that a lot of things you said I disagree with. And one thing, I think your conception of academia sort is one of exclusion and not inclusion. Where I think it sort of disregards me, myself, my culture, my people, and my community. And seeing that the future of this country itself is going to become more multi-ethnic and diverse, I am wondering, how does your conception of academics and your traditional curriculum prepare us for the diverse culture that we're going to be facing?
First, in what way are you excluded? I know that's the great language today, exclusion, and if you say that, but in what way, what conceivable way have I excluded you?
I think the traditional philosophy of some of the Greeks and that you suggest that we should be reading and looking at, I think that culture itself is coming out of a sort of a white Anglo-Saxon or just a Greek culture. I got to watch that.
You know what
but I mean, then blacks were disregarded or not seen as any sort of force in the country, and how can anything that they come up with reflect our needs? I mean, I think right now people are, when you have a curriculum that does sort of show that there is diversity in our community, people do sort of become sensitized to different people.
And that sounds so much like propaganda. I mean, you obviously weren't impressed by the E.B. Du Bois quote. You feel he was just an Uncle Tom, or what?
Excuse me?
You feel he was just an Uncle Tom?
I think that was a different time period.
I don't. But what's the difference? It was harder for blacks then than it is now.
It was, but what was looked at as traditional academics then is that's what he more or less had to learn and be a part
that's
of.
not what he said. You know, I had to learn traditional academics. No, said this was a great liberation, where I read authors who were beyond the race question, who opened me up, gave me all kinds of categories, tools of analysis for understanding my situation. I don't see any reason why there's not an Armenian author on the list, why an Armenian couldn't get up now and say, where's the Armenian contribution? I mean, what is this, a political rally where every group has to be represented? I mean, I come from a relatively excluded minority with whom there were not many books on the list.
But Shakespeare and Aristotle didn't help prepare us for help foster and change.
They surely did. My goodness, it was Aristotle who made the fundamental distinction, which was the first about the unnaturalness of most or almost all slavery. And that was the founding of a tradition, which you won't find anyplace else, of reasonable discourse. And we really sometimes have to go back to those things to refresh ourselves. I mean, you see, the question is, we are a very diverse community. I mean, nobody can deny that, but the question is whether in a diverse community, whether we also don't think about what we can possibly have in common is important. And that was, of course, the American tradition. Perhaps that will change, but that you could have any ethnic, racial, religious group you want. But one thing you had to do is understand the principles of individual liberty, which are common to all of us, and that, in a way, is the most important thing about America.
But you seem to suggest something that doesn't include a study of philosophy or the views or literature of different ethnic groups.
No, it depends on whether they have a philosophy. I mean, honestly, I mean, seriously, Arabic philosophy is not non-Western. I mean, there's talk about Muslim. Well, of course, I mean, it's largely influenced by the Greek. There's a kind of demagogic character to that. If there is no writing, most of the nations, in history, in the world didn't have any writing, so there was at least no written philosophy. And then a question how we would know what their philosophy is. So that leaves really India, China, and Japan somewhat dependently on those small groups, and we ought to see what they contribute. But is there? I mean, because there were no Muslim authors on the science curriculum, would that mean that it's an exclusive and unfair curriculum? Would that imply it?
I guess I'm not really calling to question the importance or significance of some of the Greek philosophers. I guess I'm saying is that there needs to be a balance.
The question is that the way you think? Will you even start thinking that way? You find people who have something to say seriously about these issues. And of course, it has been a shame to most nations of the world. You know, everybody, you know, how good the Greeks were at this and how rich they were. Thousands of years went by without anything equivalent. But is that a reason for rejecting them? Is that a question of national pride or something? That there's a kind of difference between their national customs, marching under one's own flag, and what one reads. One ought to be able to have the experience of transcendence of one's special situation. That's my sense of what it ought to be. And I think Du Bois recognized that in the other remark, and which really was motivating at Stanford, no matter how much Henry, I spoke to last year, the dean or professor said Henry, what said, phrase this, that the Stanford thing was infinitely more serious that it was put out publicly. I think that's a serious deterioration for everybody involved. I mean, you would have to judge more specifically black, but it is certainly a tremendous evolution of the university, the difference between what Du Bois said and the Black student.
This is going to be our last question.
Professor Cabell, on the Stanford question, I'd like to hear your view of the dead white European males that was put out there. Do you see that as mere rhetoric, or is there something more to it? Is it mental courage or mental soberness?
Literature, you will be confined, obviously, to the heritage of the written languages. But I see no reason why large parts of the world should be excluded on the basis of overall ignorance, when in fact they have materials that are of a quality
look, but you don't seem to be facing it. The fact that there is a very powerful movement which is transforming the humanities every place that says precisely the very distinction between good and bad, serious and not serious, is a result of hegemonic domination, and that is having an enormous influence in this country.
It's not true that the West is the only place that engaged in non-Western study. The Japanese engaged a great
I'm
deal in
talking
Western studies
under the influence
in the 19th century,
but under
and
the
before.
influence of the imitation of the West. The only places where this was done was either in something like economic imitation, or almost always languages were learned by conquest. That's an important reflection to make.
What I don't see is why this should be put in terms of conquest, imperialism.
But I'm arguing that the center, the most exclusive center, against an argument that this is that the West has no inclination to understand the non-West. I'm talking about a debate that's going on that's very powerful, and I suspect you and I are not in great disagreement about the central issue. The question is whether there's not a tremendous transformation of thought which has nothing to do with learning other places, but to change American minds, to make them more open. Yeah, and I think that that is an enormous. Yeah, but you see, that's what I specifically said I was doing, and the fruitful debate between us, might be about which ones, which things, how you go about it. But I don't think we would be in fundamental agreement because you're a man I know from our previous encounter, what I've read of you, respects quality and thinks it's important. But the notion that good and bad are anything other than imposed distinctions, which is really epidemic in the throughout the country, which the Duke business and the Stanford business are only the tips of the iceberg. I think that's very important. They're a real threat to our intellectual freedom.
Since you said some nice things about me, I'd like to discussion up.
We're adjourned.